On the side of a lonely highway where the last whispers of winter still clung to the air, two tiny golden retriever puppies were tied to a steel post, left to face the cold winds and the thunder of passing trucks. No food, no warmth, just trembling paws and wide, fearful eyes. They were too young to understand why they had been abandoned, too weak to even bark for help, and the man who left them there believed no one would stop. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching, a stranger, an aging man with a weathered heart and a past full of shadows, was about to make a choice that would change not only their lives, but his own. This is a story of cruelty, survival, and an unexpected act of kindness that will leave you breathless. What happens next will stay with you long after the last word. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly under a pale, stubborn sun, its light casting golden slants across the earth, but offering no true warmth. Though the thick snows had melted weeks ago, the air remained sharp, biting through even heavy coats, and the wind whipped restlessly across the highway, carrying dust, dry grass, and the last traces of winter's breath. A weather-beaten red pickup truck rumbled down the long, empty stretch of highway. Its body was dented from years of rough work, rust blooming along the edges of its doors like old battle scars. Behind the wheel sat Michael Harper, 70 years old, his large hands gripping the wheel in practiced stillness. He had once been a formidable man, tall, broad-shouldered, and strong, but time had whittled his frame down, sharpening his joints and deepening the lines etched across his face. His sharp blue eyes, though dulled at the edges by age, still held a spark, a watchful, assessing flicker that had once marked him as one of the best officers in the Cheyenne Police Department. Michael was a man who had spent his life walking a straight line, but life had not repaid that honesty kindly. Years ago, he'd uncovered corruption deep within the force, believing, naively perhaps, that exposing it would bring change. Instead, he had been chewed up, spat out, forced into early retirement on trumped-up charges. His pension gone, his reputation shattered, Michael found himself fighting a new kind of battle: poverty, loneliness, and the long, slow fade of meaning. His wife, Ellen, had stayed with him through it all, her slender figure a constant presence at his side, her honey-colored hair and soft smile the only light in his increasingly dark world. But when cancer came, they found themselves without the savings, without the connections, without the help they needed. She died 3 years ago in their tiny home on the outskirts of town, her hand in his, whispering, "Let it go, Mike." But he hadn't let it go. These days, Michael got by doing odd repair jobs, patching fences, fixing machinery, mending roofs, anything that brought in a little cash. His old German shepherd, Rusty, Ellen's dog, really, was his only constant companion, the two of them sharing long drives and longer silences. On this particular afternoon, Michael was on his way back from a supply run to a town 2 hours over, where the food was cheaper and the fuel discounts still worked. His truck bed was piled with bags of rice, cans of beans, propane tanks, and a few rolls of heavy wool blankets. The sun gleamed off the windshield, but the wind rattled the truck, slipping cold fingers in through the cracked window seals. Michael leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing against the glare, and then a flicker, something pale at the edge of the road. His pulse kicked up, his foot easing off the gas as his sharp gaze locked onto the shapes. He pulled over, the gravel crunching under his tires, and cut the engine, the sudden silence filling the cab like a held breath. With a grunt, Michael swung open the creaking door and stepped out. The wind hit him first, sharp and cold despite the sun, tugging at his old jacket. He pulled the collar tighter as his boots crunched over the roadside gravel. There, tied tightly to the base of a rusted highway sign, were two tiny puppies. Golden retrievers, no older than 2 months, their fur matted with dirt and oil, their thin bodies trembling violently. One lay curled tightly against the other, eyes glazed and dull, too weak to lift its head. The larger one gave a faint, wheezing whimper, its tail barely twitching. Michael's breath caught in his chest. He crouched slowly, knees popping, and extended a rough, scarred hand toward them. The larger puppy flinched, but had no strength to resist. The smaller one didn't move at all, its tiny chest barely rising and falling. The rope around their necks had dug deep, leaving raw marks on the tender skin. Michael exhaled, a slow, shaky breath that misted in the cold air. "God damn it," he murmured softly. His voice was gravelly, rusty from long disuse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old pocket knife, the wooden handle worn smooth from decades of service. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something older, something he hadn't felt in years. He set the blade gently against the coarse rope, sawing carefully. His mind raced even as his hands stayed steady. Who the hell would do this? How long have they been out here? He glanced up and down the empty highway. Not a soul in sight. Just his truck, the wind, the sun, and these two tiny abandoned lives. As the last of the rope fell away, Michael sat back on his heels. The puppies were free, but they were limp, their small bodies cold and fragile in the sharp air. He hesitated, rough hands hovering just above their trembling forms. He had no plan. He had no money for a vet. Hell, he barely had money for himself. His house was small, the heat unreliable, the supplies stretched thin. But as he looked down at these two tiny creatures, he felt something flicker inside his chest. Something fierce. Something old. Michael Harper had been many things in his life. A cop, a husband, a man betrayed, a man broken. But one thing he had never been, not once, not ever, was the kind of man who walked away. He squared his shoulders, the old determination hardening his jaw. He reached down and as gently as his big rough hands could manage, he scooped the puppies up, cradling them carefully against his chest. "All right, little ones," he murmured, voice low and steady. "You're coming with me." Michael Harper sat behind the wheel, his large hands resting heavily on the worn steering wheel as the truck idled on the side of the road. His breath misted faintly in the cab despite the weak warmth from the old heater. Beside him, wrapped carefully in his thick wool jacket, were the two trembling golden retriever puppies he had just cut free from the cruel ropes binding them to the highway sign. Their tiny bodies shuddered under the blanket, their golden fur streaked with mud and oil, their bellies sunken, ribs faintly visible. Michael reached over with a rough, calloused hand, fingers stiff from decades of hard work, and gently touched the smaller puppy's belly. His fingertips came away cold. His chest tightened. The larger puppy gave a faint, wheezing whimper, barely strong enough to lift its head. Michael cursed softly under his breath. He rummaged in the center console until his fingers closed on an old water bottle, dented and dusty. Unscrewing the cap, he poured a few drops into the plastic lid and held it carefully to the stronger puppy's mouth. It licked faintly, tongue flicking over the water, while the smaller one stayed limp and still. Michael sat back, running a hand through his thinning silver hair, jaw tightening. His beard, once dark and neatly kept, had gone coarse and white, bristling over sharp cheekbones hollowed by age. His deep-set blue eyes, once known on the police force as sharp, unflinching, now looked tired, ringed with faint shadows. At 70, Michael bore the look of a man worn thin, not by laziness or decay, but by the slow grinding of life's misfortunes. 10 years ago, after a fierce argument, his only son Nathan had stormed out of the house and never returned. Nathan, once a lanky boy with his mother's soft brown hair, had been 30 the last time Michael saw him, standing in the doorway, face flushed with anger, fists clenched, shouting that he was done with his father's stubbornness. The house had been quiet ever since. His wife, Ellen, had died soon after Nathan left. Cancer, slow, brutal, draining not just her strength, but every bit of money Michael had managed to scrape together after his forced retirement. She had passed away in their bedroom, her frail hand in his, whispering, "Please, Mike, don't grow old alone." But old alone was exactly what he had become. The house sat on the edge of a dry, wind-bitten stretch of Wyoming plain, a squat wooden structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Inside, the furniture sagged too, a couch worn thin by years, a table scarred with old cigarette burns, a sagging bookshelf filled with faded photos. Only Rusty, the old German shepherd Ellen had brought home years ago, kept Michael company now, padding quietly through the house, his graying muzzle resting often on Michael's knee, as if sensing the weight pressing on his master's shoulders. Michael looked down at the two puppies in his passenger seat, wrapped like fragile cargo in his coat. He sighed, voice low, gravelly. "All right, little ones. Max, Daisy, let's get you home." He turned the truck carefully back onto the highway, tires crunching over gravel. The sun had begun to slip lower, casting long golden shadows across the open plains. As he drove, Michael spoke softly, the way a man does when he hasn't had a conversation in days. "I can't promise much," he murmured. "Old house, leaky roof, temperamental heater, and I ain't got much left in the fridge but beans and rice." He gave a faint, rough-edged chuckle. "But it's warm, and it's better than this godforsaken road." The truck rumbled slowly down the dirt driveway as the sky blushed pink and orange behind him. Rusty waited by the porch, his large body stiff with age, eyes alert as he watched his master step out carefully, cradling the two new arrivals in his arms. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and old leather. Michael moved through the dim living room, the wooden floor creaking under his boots. He laid the puppies gently on a folded blanket near the wood stove, tucking the jacket tighter around their tiny bodies. Rusty settled nearby, his gray-flecked snout resting on his front paws, watching curiously but calmly. Michael straightened slowly, his joints aching. He stood there a long moment, looking down at the small creatures shivering softly in the fading light. He felt something stir in his chest, a faint warmth, an ache of memory. Morning crept into Michael Harper's house slowly, as if hesitant to cross the cracked windows and faded curtains. Pale sunlight spilled across the small wooden floor, painting the room in delicate streaks of gold. The air inside was faintly warmer than the sharp chill outside, thanks to the old wood stove crackling softly in the corner. Near it, on a heap of layered blankets and towels, lay Max and Daisy, the two golden retriever puppies Michael had saved from the roadside. Their tiny bodies, still weak, shuddered slightly with every breath, their thin golden fur dull and tangled. Michael sat on a low stool nearby, his tall frame folded awkwardly, elbows on his knees, watching them with sharp blue eyes rimmed in exhaustion. His broad shoulders, once powerful, now slumped under the weight of years. His rough hands clasped tightly together as if in silent prayer. He hadn't slept much. He'd been up most of the night, checking on them, stroking their tiny heads, warming a rag on the stove to wipe the dirt and filth from their bodies. He hadn't intended to become a caretaker again, not at 70, after everything. The house creaked faintly as Michael rose, his knees stiff, his breath catching slightly as he straightened. He moved to the narrow kitchen, opening the old fridge. Its light flickered weakly, revealing little more than a carton of eggs, half a loaf of bread, and some leftover stew. Michael sighed, rubbed a hand over his face, and reached for a pot on the stove, warming some water to thin out the last of his powdered milk. As he worked, his mind drifted. He thought back to the days when this house was filled with voices. Ellen's soft laugh, Nathan's excited chatter. Back then, he had come home every night to warmth, to a family who believed in him. But 10 years had passed since Nathan stormed out, slamming the door behind him, vowing never to return. 10 years since Ellen's cancer diagnosis, since the slow, painful decline that had taken her from him one breath at a time. Now the house echoed only with the whisper of the wind and, for the first time in a long time, the soft whimpers and shallow breaths of two small creatures who needed him. Michael returned to the puppies, kneeling carefully. His large hands, rough and scarred, trembled slightly as he lifted Max's head, coaxing a few drops of warm milk onto the tiny pink tongue. Max's eyes fluttered open briefly, weak but responsive. Daisy remained still, her breathing faint but present. "You're fighters, huh?" Michael murmured, his voice a low rumble, softened by something old and aching. "Good. That's good." He stayed beside them, resting his back against the worn armchair, the warmth of the stove slowly seeping into his bones. He watched them closely, noting the rise and fall of their tiny chests, the occasional flicker of their paws as they dreamed. He remembered vividly the night he pulled Nathan from the lake as a boy, his small body limp, face pale after slipping through the ice. He remembered the terror, the relief, the overwhelming surge of purpose. For the first time since Ellen's funeral, Michael felt that fierce pull again. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door, startling him. Standing outside was Jack Taylor, a man in his late 50s, stocky with short-cropped gray hair and a sun-weathered face. Jack had been a fellow officer once, back when Michael still wore the badge. Life had hit Jack differently. After retiring, he opened a small hardware shop, became a local fixture, the kind of man who always had a smile and a story. "Mike," Jack greeted, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Heard a rumor you've got yourself some house guests." Michael narrowed his eyes slightly, one brow lifting. "That was fast," Jack chuckled. "Small town. You know how it is. Sarah Caldwell was in the shop this morning, mentioned you buying up half her pet aisle. Figured I'd stop by, see if you need anything." Michael shifted his weight, hesitating for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Inside, Jack's gaze softened as he spotted the puppies on the blanket. "Damn," he murmured, kneeling slowly, his joints creaking. "Look at you two. Barely bigger than my boots." His voice, normally loud and boisterous, softened as he reached out a thick, work-roughened hand to gently stroke Max's tiny head. "You always were the stubborn one, Mike." Michael folded his arms across his chest. "They would have died." Jack looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yeah, I know." He rose, brushing his knees. "Listen, if you need anything, supplies, help, whatever, you let me know. Don't have to do this alone." Michael gave a short nod, the words catching slightly in his throat. After Jack left, the house settled back into its quiet rhythm. Michael busied himself tending to Max and Daisy, refreshing their water, warming their bedding, cleaning the last of the grime from their tiny paws. He noticed, as he worked, that they no longer flinched when he touched them. Instead, they leaned faintly into his hands, soft muzzles pressing into his palm, small bodies trembling not with fear, but with the first sparks of trust. That night, as Michael sat near the stove, he caught himself whispering softly to them. Old stories, memories, little murmured comforts. He realized, with a faint start, that the house no longer felt quite so empty. The morning air was cold but bright, the kind of crisp Wyoming day where the sunlight fooled you into thinking it was warmer than it really was. Michael Harper wrapped his old wool coat tighter around his tall, stooped frame as he walked slowly toward town, the stiff wind pulling at the edges of his gray cap. His sharp blue eyes squinted slightly against the light, deep lines furrowing his weathered face. In his arms, swaddled tightly in a blanket, lay Max and Daisy, the two tiny golden retriever puppies whose survival now consumed his every thought. They stirred faintly as he walked, their small bodies pressed close together and trembling not from fear now, but from the lingering effects of cold and weakness. Michael kept one hand braced under the bundle, feeling each small shudder, the occasional twitch of a paw, the faint, damp breath against the fabric. He hated leaving the house, hated exposing them to the cold, but the supplies were gone. If they were going to pull through, they needed more milk powder, more cloths, more than what his battered old cupboards could provide. The town of Miller's Creek came into view as he crested the low hill, its single main street lined with brick front shops, wooden porches, and a few cars dusted with road grit. People moved up and down the sidewalks, bundled against the wind, nodding greetings to one another, sharing bits of gossip. Michael felt their glances even before he stepped onto the street, the way conversations slowed when he passed, the way eyes flicked from him to the bundled shapes in his arms. It had been years since Michael Harper had been the subject of anyone's interest. After the disgrace of his forced retirement, after Ellen's death, after Nathan's long absence, people had mostly left him alone, a silent, stoic figure living on the edge of town, minding his own business. But today, they stared. He pushed open the door to Caldwell's General Store, the old bell above the frame chiming softly. The warmth inside hit him first, followed by the smell of wood polish, flour, and dried herbs. Shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from canned goods to pet supplies. Behind the counter stood Sarah Caldwell, the store's owner, a tall, lean woman in her mid-40s with striking green eyes, high cheekbones, and a cascade of chestnut curls pinned loosely at the back of her head. Her pale, freckled skin gave her a youthful look, but the sharp set of her mouth and the faint crease between her brows marked her as someone who had weathered her own share of storms. Sarah glanced up from her ledger, her brow lifting slightly. "Michael Harper," she said with quiet surprise, setting down her pen. "That's a rare sight." Michael shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the blanket in his arms. "Need some things, Sarah. Milk powder, cloths, maybe some soft dog food." His voice was low, rough, the words reluctant. Sarah stepped out from behind the counter, her long frame graceful despite the practicality of her jeans and boots. She moved closer, eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the small shapes bundled in the blanket. "Are those puppies?" Michael hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Found them on the highway. Someone left them tied to a signpost." Sarah's sharp green eyes softened, a flicker of something like anger crossing her freckled face. "Who would do that to babies this small?" she murmured, reaching out carefully to lift the blanket's edge. She caught sight of Max's thin, gold-furred head, his small, damp nose barely peeking through, and her expression tightened further. Michael cleared his throat. "They need feeding. I'll cover whatever it costs." Sarah met his gaze, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Michael, I think we both know you're not exactly rolling in cash." She reached out, resting a slender, work-roughened hand lightly on his sleeve. "Take what you need. Pay me when you can." Michael stiffened, pride flaring up sharply. "I pay my debts, Sarah." Her smile softened, but she didn't argue. "I know, Michael." She stepped back, gesturing toward the shelves. "I'll pack up the supplies. Give me a few minutes." As she worked, a few other customers drifted into the store. Mrs. Redmond, the widow from up the hill, bundled in a heavy wool coat, her thin face sharp and inquisitive. Tim Avery, the local mailman, a short, wiry man in his 50s with a quick grin and restless energy. "Morning, Michael," Tim greeted with a nod, his eyes flicking curiously to the blanket. "Heard you were up to something new." Michael gave a faint grunt in response, shifting slightly as Mrs. Redmond edged closer, peering with sharp gray eyes. "Are those puppies, Michael Harper?" she asked, her voice thin but sharp. "Why, I can't imagine you with pets." Michael's jaw tightened. He said nothing, turning slightly away. Sarah appeared then, carrying a box of supplies. She shot a quick glance at the growing cluster of curious onlookers and said lightly, "Let's give Michael some space, folks." Her tone was kind, but there was steel beneath it, the kind that made people listen. Outside, the whispers began to spread. Michael Harper, the disgraced ex-cop, the quiet old man living alone at the edge of town, had rescued puppies, was looking after them, feeding them, walking into town with them bundled in his arms like treasures. By the time Michael left the store, carefully balancing the box of supplies, he could feel the shift in the air. Eyes watched him from windows. Heads turned as he passed. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching thoughtfully as he walked away. As Michael trudged back up the road toward his house, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't known in years, the weight of being seen, and, perhaps, the possibility of being understood. Evening settled over Miller's Creek, drawing long shadows across the hills and painting the sky in streaks of lavender and pink. Michael Harper sat at his worn kitchen table, the overhead light casting a dim glow across the scattered scraps of evidence before him. His sharp blue eyes, weathered by age but still piercing, flicked from one item to the next. The frayed piece of rope he'd cut from around the puppies' necks, the tiny metal tag dangling loosely from Max's thin collar, the faint marks along their fur where restraints had rubbed raw. Michael's back ached as he leaned forward, his large hands rough and scarred, working carefully to straighten the tag under the light. He'd nearly missed it at first. The small engraving faded, the phone number barely legible. But now, as he traced a calloused finger across the tiny letters, something old stirred inside him. Something he hadn't called upon in years. The sharp, methodical instincts of a trained investigator. He jotted down the details in a battered notebook, the same kind he'd once carried in his coat pocket during his days on the force. His pen moved slowly, the letters thick and uneven, but determined. The name on the tag, Granger. Michael's brow furrowed. He knew that name. Thomas Granger, 50 years old, a prominent figure in Miller's Creek. Tall and broad-shouldered, Thomas had the kind of presence that filled a room. Silver-streaked hair cut close to his head, sharp features, a square jaw covered in a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. His pale blue eyes were often described as piercing, though Michael had always found them cold, calculating. On the surface, Thomas was the town's darling, a wealthy businessman who donated to local schools, sponsored charity drives, hosted community events, but Michael had seen enough in his life to know that clean surfaces often hid the dirtiest secrets. He leaned back, the old wooden chair creaking under his weight, and stared at the ceiling. Why would Thomas Granger's name be on the collar of 2 abandoned puppies? Why leave them tied to a highway sign in the freezing cold? Michael's jaw tightened, the deep lines around his mouth hardening. He rose slowly, pulling on his heavy coat and scarf. Max and Daisy were asleep by the stove, curled tightly together, their breathing soft and rhythmic. Michael knelt briefly, his large hand brushing gently over their tiny heads. "Stay warm, little ones," he murmured, voice low and rough. "I'll be back soon." The night air was sharp against his face as he stepped outside, the gravel crunching under his boots. He walked through town with quiet determination, his long stride steady despite the stiffness in his knees. Miller's Creek at night was a sleepy place. Shop fronts dark, houses lit only by soft window lamps. But Michael wasn't heading toward the heart of town. He was heading toward the edge, where the largest house sat behind tall iron gates. The Granger estate loomed against the night sky, its white stone walls glowing faintly under the moonlight. Michael approached carefully, his sharp eyes scanning the grounds. He remembered the layout from years ago, the long driveway lined with trimmed hedges, the wide porch lit by twin lanterns, the detached garage where Granger's imported cars were kept. But it wasn't the house Michael wanted. It was the back, where the kennels were. He moved along the edge of the fence, the cold metal biting against his gloved hands as he gripped the bars. Beyond, the faint outlines of cages took shape in the dark, the soft whimpering of dogs drifting through the night air. Michael's stomach clenched. He crouched low, slipping through a gap in the side hedge, and moved carefully toward the kennel doors. The closer he got, the clearer the sounds became. Dogs, many of them. Some pacing anxiously, others silent and still. He caught the glint of collars, the flash of identification tags, the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the sharper scent of fear. And then, a voice. Thomas Granger emerged from the side of the house, tall and imposing even in the dim light. He wore a heavy black coat over a tailored suit, his silver hair glinting faintly. At his side walked a man Michael didn't recognize. Younger, maybe mid-30s, thin and nervous-looking, with a narrow face and quick, darting eyes. "I told you to move them out by Friday." Thomas's voice was low, but edged with steel. "We can't keep holding the overflow here. It's bad for business." Michael's heart pounded. He flattened himself against the side of the kennel, listening intently. The younger man shifted uneasily. "I'm working on it, Mr. Granger. Just delays with the transport, but we'll clear them out soon." Thomas let out a slow, dangerous breath. "Do it. And no mistakes this time. We can't afford attention." Michael's fists clenched at his sides. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the pulse-quickening surge of a man on the edge of discovery. He slipped quietly back through the hedge, heart hammering, and began the long walk home. The town hall of Miller's Creek was an old, white-painted building with wide wooden steps and a tall, narrow bell tower that hadn't rung in decades. On this particular evening, its main room buzzed with voices. The townspeople packed shoulder to shoulder under dim brass lights, winter coats draped over chairs, boots tracking in cold air from the outside. It wasn't often the whole town gathered like this, but the news had spread, faster than even Michael Harper had expected. Michael stood quietly near the back of the room, his tall frame wrapped in his heavy brown coat, his silver-streaked hair tucked under his wool cap. His weathered face was set, jaw clenched, the sharp blue eyes under heavy brows fixed forward. In his large, rough hands, he gripped a battered folder. Worn papers, faded photos, carefully collected evidence from the last few days. At the front of the room, Thomas Granger stood with the easy confidence of a man used to being admired. 50 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharply cut features, a perfectly trimmed salt and pepper beard, and slicked-back silver hair, Thomas wore a dark tailored coat over a fine suit, the kind that signaled wealth without saying a word. His pale blue eyes sparkled faintly with amusement as he chatted with the mayor, occasionally shaking hands with neighbors who approached. The mayor, John Dalton, was a thin man in his 60s, balding with wispy gray hair, a neatly pressed plaid shirt under a puffer vest. He was known as fair, but cautious, the kind of leader who avoided conflict whenever possible. John's eyes flicked anxiously between Thomas and the murmuring crowd, sensing the tension but unsure where it was headed. Michael waited, his heart pounding steadily. He could feel Sarah Caldwell's presence beside him, the tall, lean woman with curly chestnut hair, sharp green eyes, and a freckled face set in determination. She had been one of the first to believe him, standing at his side when others only offered doubtful glances. Sarah wore a thick knitted scarf over a plain gray sweater and jeans, her long hands folded calmly, but her eyes never left Thomas. The mayor cleared his throat and tapped the microphone at the front. "Evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on short notice. We know there's been talk, and we want to address concerns openly and fairly." Thomas stepped forward smoothly, his smile calm, his voice even. "Good evening, friends. I'm sure some of you have heard some rumors circulating. I want to assure you, my work and my business are fully in support of this community. I love this town, you know that." He spread his hands graciously, his deep voice rolling over the room like warm syrup. Michael felt his stomach turn. He took a step forward. The murmurs grew as heads turned. Michael Harper, the disgraced ex-cop, the man who hadn't stood before this community in over a decade, was walking to the front, his heavy boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He stopped beside the mayor's podium, his tall figure looming, his blue eyes sharp and hard. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he opened the folder in his hands, pulling out a photo, the frayed rope that had been tied around Max and Daisy's necks. Another photo, the tiny metal tags still looped loosely on their collars. Another, the thin bruised marks along their delicate fur. Michael laid them on the table at the front, his large hand flattening the papers. "These aren't rumors," he said, his voice rough but steady. "These are facts." The room quieted. Thomas gave a small, tight smile. "Michael, I'm not sure what you think you're implying." Michael cut him off, lifting a paper. A sworn statement from the delivery man, a thin, nervous-faced worker named Eddie Simmons, who had come forward after Michael quietly questioned him. Eddie, in his early 30s, thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and a perpetual twitch at the corner of his mouth, had been afraid, but finally admitted that he had delivered cages to the Granger estate, more cages than any one man should need. "Eddie Simmons gave me this," Michael continued, holding up the paper. "He's not here tonight because he's afraid, but the truth doesn't care about fear." His voice grew firmer, louder, carrying across the still room. "These puppies weren't abandoned by chance. They weren't strays. They were thrown away because they were evidence. Evidence of a man who uses this town's good reputation to hide something rotten." A ripple spread through the crowd, murmurs, shuffling. Sharp glances thrown toward Thomas. Thomas's face darkened faintly, the easy smile tightening at the edges. "Now, hold on." But Sarah stepped forward, her freckled face fierce, her sharp green eyes glinting. "No, Thomas, you hold on." Her voice rang clear and sure, slicing through the rising tension. "We've all looked the other way when it comes to your business, but Michael's right. If we don't stand up now, when will we?" The room buzzed, voices rising. People who had once whispered now spoke aloud, faces flushed with realization and anger. Michael raised one hand, quieting the room. His voice dropped low, but every word carried. "If we don't protect the smallest, the weakest among us, what kind of people are we?" For a moment, silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken shame, unspoken courage. Then the murmurs shifted, the crowd stirring. People moved closer, not toward Thomas, but toward Michael, toward Sarah. And for the first time in years, Michael Harper saw not suspicion in their eyes, but something else entirely: respect. In the days following the town meeting, Miller's Creek transformed. The whispers that once followed Michael Harper's solitary figure were replaced by praise, respect, even admiration. People he hadn't spoken to in years stopped him in the street, offering nods, handshakes, and quiet thanks. Sarah Caldwell, always graceful yet sharp-eyed, became a sort of unofficial partner in his mission, checking in, delivering supplies, and keeping the town informed. But the biggest ripple spread far beyond the town itself. The local paper, the Miller's Creek Gazette, ran a front-page photo. Michael, silver-haired and stooped, sitting on his porch in his old wooden chair, the two tiny golden puppies curled up fast asleep on his lap. His sharp blue eyes, lined with age but steady as ever, looked straight at the camera, one large, rough hand resting protectively over the small bodies. The caption read, "The quiet man who saved them all." From there, the story spread. Social media picked it up, first local, then statewide, and soon further. as animal rescue pages, small-town news sites, and feel-good blogs shared the photo. Comments flooded in. People praising his courage, people calling him a hero, people asking if they could help. And one of those people, sitting in a cramped apartment 2 states away, stared at the photo with a pounding heart. Nathan Harper was 40 now, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but leaner, with neatly cropped light brown hair and a short beard framing a strong jaw. His eyes, sharp and stormy blue, were his father's exactly, though they had long carried a harder edge, the residue of old wounds and unresolved anger. Nathan had walked away from Miller's Creek at 30, swearing he'd never come back. His father had been too rigid, too stubborn, too consumed by pride and a badge that, in Nathan's eyes, had ultimately cost them everything. They hadn't spoken in a decade. But now, Nathan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photo on his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly. The man in the picture looked older, smaller somehow, his hair fully white, his posture a little more bent. But his face, that face, was still Michael Harper. The man who had taught him how to ride a bike, how to fish, how to stand up for what mattered, even when it hurt. Nathan stood abruptly, shoving his phone into his jacket pocket. His mind raced. He booked a ticket before he could change his mind. 2 days later, under a gray morning sky, Nathan Harper stepped out of a taxi at the edge of the long dirt driveway he hadn't seen in 10 years. The house looked smaller than he remembered, the paint more worn, the roof sagging a little at one corner. But the porch was just as he remembered. The old rocking chair, the cracked window, the little wooden steps he'd run up 1,000 times as a boy. And there, sitting on that chair, was his father. Michael sat bundled in his brown coat, the puppies asleep in his lap, his sharp eyes watching the dirt road. His silver-white hair stirred faintly in the breeze, and though his body was smaller now, his presence was undiminished, solid, steady, like an old oak that refused to fall. Nathan hesitated at the edge of the driveway, his tall frame tense, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, his heart pounded, his throat tight. So many words pressed at the edges of his mind, but none came out. Michael looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither moved. Michael's face registered no shock, no anger, just a flicker of something quiet and deep, something old. He lifted one large rough hand slightly in greeting, his fingers brushing absently over Max's soft golden head. Nathan exhaled shakily. He took a step forward, then another. His boots crunched over the gravel. Michael's voice, when it came, was low, rough, and familiar. "You're late, boy." Nathan let out a choked laugh, his eyes burning. "Yeah, well," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I got turned around." Michael gave a faint, tired smile. "Come inside, then." The wind outside rustled softly through the bare trees, rattling the window panes of the old Harper house. Inside, the smell of wood smoke drifted lazily through the air, mingling with the faint scent of coffee. The living room, once cold and hollow with silence, now felt full, as if in the span of a single day the years of emptiness had been swept away. Michael Harper sat in his armchair, his tall frame folded into the worn fabric, his silver-white hair glowing faintly in the afternoon light. His rough hands rested on the small bodies of Max and Daisy, the 2 tiny golden retriever puppies curled contentedly on his lap, their soft golden fur rising and falling with each peaceful breath. His sharp blue eyes, so often narrowed in suspicion or hard with memory, now held something gentler, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Across from him, Nathan Harper sat on the edge of the old couch, elbows resting on his knees, his tall, lean frame folded forward slightly. At 40, Nathan was the mirror of his father in youth. Sharp blue eyes, strong jaw, light brown hair cut short at the sides, a faint scruff of beard darkening his chin. But there was something different in him now. The hard edges that had once marked their angry parting seemed softened, worn down by the years apart, by the ache of absence. The 2 men sat in a silence that was not heavy, but careful, like the pause between breaths. Nathan reached down, his large hand brushing lightly over Max's small head. The puppy stirred faintly, tail giving a feeble wag, pressing his damp nose against Nathan's boot. Daisy, slightly smaller, let out a soft whimper, her tiny paws stretching, curling, then relaxing as she nestled deeper into the blanket. Michael cleared his throat, the sound rough in the stillness. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, but touched with something raw. "You came back." Nathan let out a shaky breath, his mouth twisting into a faint, tired smile. "Yeah, Dad," he murmured, voice cracking faintly. "I came back." Outside, the crunch of footsteps sounded faintly on the gravel driveway. Michael's head lifted slightly, and a moment later, the front door swung open. Sarah Caldwell stepped inside, tall and graceful, her chestnut curls pulled back under a wool hat, her sharp green eyes flicking quickly over the room. She wore a thick knitted scarf and a simple gray coat, her freckled face flushed faintly from the cold. "Michael," she greeted with a small, warm smile, "I figured you'd need some extra blankets." Her sharp gaze flicked to Nathan, a flicker of surprise and understanding passing through her expression. Nathan rose, extending a hand automatically. "Nathan Harper." "Sarah Caldwell," she replied, shaking his hand firmly, her slender fingers cool but strong. "It's good to meet you." She glanced meaningfully toward Michael. "Your dad's been busy." Nathan gave a faint, almost embarrassed laugh, his eyes softening as they moved back to his father. "Yeah, I heard." Michael shifted slightly in his chair, one hand smoothing absently over Max's tiny back. "They've been through hell," he murmured, his voice gruff but careful. "We all have, I guess." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Sarah smiled softly, setting down the folded blankets on a nearby chair. "The whole town's coming by later, you know," she added, a note of amusement in her voice. "They want to thank you, both of you." Michael huffed faintly, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't do it for thanks." Sarah's green eyes softened. "I know." That evening, the house filled, not just with warmth, but with people. The townsfolk came in waves, their faces familiar and new. Jack Taylor, the stocky old hardware shop owner, with his easy grin and weathered hands. Mrs. Redmond, the thin, sharp-tongued widow with her tightly pinned gray hair and a surprisingly kind smile. Tim Avery, the wiry mailman with his restless energy, laughing and patting Michael on the shoulder. They brought food, blankets, gifts for the puppies, squeaky toys, soft beds, little bowls with their names already painted on them. They spoke softly at first, careful around Michael, but soon the room was filled with laughter, shared stories, hands clapping Michael's shoulder, reaching out to shake Nathan's. Michael sat quietly, letting it all swirl around him. He watched as Nathan crouched beside Max and Daisy, laughing softly as the puppies clumsily nuzzled his hands, their tiny tails wagging in sleepy excitement. He watched Sarah, standing nearby, her graceful frame silhouetted in the firelight, her sharp eyes flicking occasionally toward him with a small, knowing smile. And for the first time in so many years, Michael felt the cold inside him crack, just a little. Later, when the house had emptied, when the night had settled into quiet once more, Michael sat on the porch, the puppies asleep beside him in their little bed. Nathan stood at the railing, looking out over the darkened field, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Michael's voice broke the silence, low and rough. "You staying long?" Nathan glanced back, his mouth lifting in a faint, hesitant smile. "Yeah, Dad," he murmured, "I think I am." Michael exhaled slowly, the sound carrying faintly into the still night. He reached down, running a large, gentle hand over Max's tiny head. The puppy stirred, letting out a soft sigh, pressing closer into the blankets. Michael's eyes softened, his voice barely a whisper. "You brought them back, little guy," he murmured, a faint, almost disbelieving smile touching his mouth. "You brought my whole family home." Sometimes, miracles don't arrive as thunder or lightning. Sometimes, they come in the smallest forms. The shiver of a tiny puppy saved from the cold, the quiet return of a son after years of silence, the soft crack of a heart that has long been frozen, finally opening again. Michael Harper had thought his life was over, his purpose gone, his family shattered. But God works in ways we cannot always see, through the helpless, through the weak, through the moments when we are called to love, even when we think we have nothing left to give. This story is a reminder that no matter how lost we feel, no matter how long we have wandered, grace waits patiently for us. It reaches for us in the form of forgiveness, of second chances, of small hands, or tiny paws, that remind us we are not alone. May God bless each and every one of you watching, especially those who feel tired, forgotten, or broken. May you be reminded today that kindness leaves ripples and that no act of love is ever wasted. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment below and subscribe to this channel for more stories of hope, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Together, let's spread light in a world that so often feels dark. Click subscribe and join us on this journey of compassion. And may God's blessings be upon you and all those you love.